Look to the market to see whom you think are providing quality and top notch service. You and your colleagues will know that. Look to see what they're doing well. Some of them will be the leadership qualities, and some will be perhaps they might invest more in various parts of their business that your particular business isn't. But it might give you a whole range of ideas of what you can test out in your own organisation.
Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thanks, Adam.
I just wanted to ask you a little bit about leadership because I think my interactions with you were in your leadership positions in across healthcare. And I think something that was really interesting to me was that you were a nurse to start off with, and I just kind of wondered whether that had an influence on your leadership roles.
It certainly did. It set up, I think, those personal qualities that you bring into uh, different interactions in your life. And what I experienced as a nurse in terms of, I think that servant leadership and servant helping people. I don't want to do the violin act with that, but um, you're 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 interacting with people at their most vulnerable time, and they can be from all walks of life, all forms of status, all forms of economic background, and that's quite humbling to have that experience and the opportunity to have those interactions. So, for me to start off within the nursing profession certainly was a significant and integral component to how I've probably lived the rest of my life, really.
John, you have an evidence-based approach to your work. Can you just explain what that means, how that shapes your approach to advocacy and policy, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. Look, it's critical. It's the basis of good strategy. I think you need to have something consistent to um, approach and use as a discussion theme, whether it's with politicians or public servants or private company uh, players. Um, Unless you have an evidence base that creates that consistent foundation, um, I think you can get easily picked off. And a lot of people sort of understand that, but the one area I think it's underutilized is in the advocacy journey. So it's important that not only do you find the right stakeholders to take matters forward with you in particular areas, but that the evidence is very clear, because politicians and public servants um, will require that. So it's trite to say that, but it is underlooked.
So, John, how do you think leaders in across healthcare can position themselves to use those types of strategies in their leadership?
A lot comes down to your management style, because we don't put our hands up and say, "Oh, guess what? I want to be a leader," or "I am a leader." I think um, you become a leader by having followers, and those followers either respect certain characteristics that you may have as an individual that you bring into interactions. And so I think, as well as sort of some of the bread and butter and the machinery that you need to use, like evidence, the qualities of leadership, I think, are complex. A lot of people put their hand up and say they understand what leadership's about, but as you move through life, hopefully through experience, you do develop a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And for me, there's probably a dozen key things that are hard to put into practice, but they're not all that difficult to understand. And the more you can implement those strategies, I think the more effective you are as a leader, and the more you will probably have a lot of followers. So some of those, I think, are walking the talk. Sounds simple, but a lot of people get up and give the rhetoric and then don't put it into practice themselves. Share successes. be vulnerable, share your vulnerability with your team, um, aim for excellence. As I said, these all seem really simple, but it's hard work to continue to be having these as your top of mind. Develop your team; they're your greatest asset. They'll eventually understand whether you believe in them or not. So they'll see through the jargon much more quickly than you will. Have KPIs. So, you don't have to be the best friend with all your team, but you need to have a very clear understanding with them about how you're all going to take something forward. So have very clear KPIs. Don't have too many, maybe just have 4 or 5 that you work on for each of your team members as the year progresses, and you hold them accountable to what you mutually agree and you sign off on. I think encourage and accept feedback. Again, sounds simple, but it's not easy to do, especially where it's negative feedback about your own behaviour and interactions and conduct. And above all, I think you need to all be on the same values. You need to sign up to the same set of values, because if you don't do that, you may as well go somewhere else. And then let your team get on with it. Delegate and don't micromanage.
We like to talk about pillars of excellence, and that they're all very much you've defined a lot of those things there, and what we like to talk about. But John, your work with consumer advocacy, can you please talk about that and your history in the field, going back from a legal background, I believe, and coming through now to the health industry, because you've got such a large body of work. Can you please talk about that?
Yeah, Danny, I think the common theme throughout is it's primarily all been in healthcare, and various sort of key roles that have led my work in healthcare over different periods of time. But I started off as a clinician, as a cardiothoracic nurse, intensive care specialist, and I enjoyed the evidence that was associated with that, as well as the human interaction that I spoke about earlier. And then I just flowed into different other things that just happened to be offered to me, or I was fortunate enough to be around at the right time. But I got involved in some major work value cases in nursing in the 80s, the early 80s. And so I signed up to do a law degree part-time while I was working on those industrial cases, and ended up becoming a lawyer and looking after health clients as a lawyer. So, and that was, again, I was extremely privileged, I felt, because it's like a general practice in health as a lawyer. You might be involved in corporate law in terms of mergers and acquisitions, and advising companies about different takeover opportunities and looking at anti-competitive practices and what might be some of the limitations there. But it goes right through to the medico-legal aspects of what healthcare practitioners do and have to be confronted with on a day-to-day basis. Associated with that, a lot of the court type of work with litigation in the medico-legal and negligence spaces. I didn't do a lot of work in that area, but you're exposed to that, and your background in healthcare made the conversations with clients very real. They saw it as quite genuine, and you did have something to offer. Probably as I moved through many years in that space, I started to do more work at board level in terms of governance and regulatory compliance, risk management of entities within the health space, both acute care and private and rural regional type stuff. At the same time, I was very interested in personally in the governance limitations of non-profit entities that work nationally in Australia. A lot of charities were federated, so they were set up in every state and territory, and they often had a national company set up as well. So you may have up to 8 or 9 entities, and I can give you lots of examples, but when I was CEO of the Heart Foundation, there was a separate entity with a separate board and a separate CEO in every state and territory. Huh. And I was also the national CEO of the national company. So it creates a lot of inefficiency. And when you're using philanthropic donations, you need to be able to go back and be accountable for the way you're running your organisation, as well as spending money on your objects. In this case, it's heart health. So I took a lot of interest in that. So probably for the last 25 years, I've been involved in a lot of transformational work in the non-profit space, mainly with federated entities, working and helping them move to either a single national entity or in some cases a reduced number, but still more efficient and effective.
It must complicate things when I know you like to keep things simple, and it must complicate things when there's more layers of bureaucracy, when there's different entities involved. Is that difficult to navigate your way through?
Look, it's personally political and emotional because everybody wants to hang on to their own turf. I'll give you one quick example. When I was at the Heart Foundation, this isn't exposing any confidences or anything, but I think it was the World Heart Day or something one year, and I got a call from a journalist who asked me, did she want me to follow the press release put out by the West Australian entity or the national entity on the same subject? Neither knew that they were both putting out one, and both were different. So that's just a very practical example of, a whole lot of the stupidity of having a number of entities trying to do the same work. But if you basically said to a state, look, why don't you wind up and we'll work as a single national entity? They see it as very threatening, obviously, because they think they're going to lose local influence and local input and local power, particularly if you say, look, dissolve your board and maybe dissolve the company, and you don't need a CEO there anymore. You can work with one CEO for the country. So they're all quite controversial issues and very personal. And I can think of another non-profit I was helping at one stage, and they were in deep financial trouble. They didn't have time to even work on any of the objectives that they were set up to try and achieve. They were just chasing their tail the whole time. But they were trying to convince the same thing, but within one state. They were trying to convince the regional entities to dissolve and just work as a single state in this particular charitable area. And, one of the regions, they just said they weren't going to do that. And their only asset was a house that they were bequeathed 20 years earlier, and they didn't want to give the house over to the single entity.
Right.
But it didn't create any money for them to do any work. So that's just hundreds and hundreds of examples like that every day across the country.
So, John, in these roles, as you said, there's people are quite resistant to change. How have you managed to navigate these positions that you've held and drive change in a positive way, as opposed to being seen as the bad guy who's come in and kind of messed everything up?
Yeah, Adam, I think it comes back to the values. I think if you spend time communicating with your team and your stakeholder groups about what are the values you're all operating from, so that will often enable some of the emotional stuff to be able to be placed aside. And then you can start to objectively use the evidence to talk about what do you all want to achieve together. And then delegate and get out of the way and let your team do it. So I've said some of these things already, but if you're doing that and your team believes in it and you're all working on the same hymn sheet, you can achieve an enormous amount. And when you're in that space, it's extremely exciting and extremely rewarding.
Can you think of somewhere or maybe an example where that's worked extremely well, where you've had like a really awesome outcome?
Probably the best example for me was being able to work within the Heart Foundation to actually explain and get acceptance that 9 companies and 9 boards and 9 CEOs was just not a useful spend for our donors or for those people in the community we were trying to help. And you could come up with all sorts of evidentiary lines that made that sensible. Like I would go back to the various boards very early in those conversations and say, look, I've been speaking to our donors and they really want to still keep helping us, but they won't give us any more money until I can go back and tell them that I'm spending 91 cents in the dollar on stakeholders instead of 80 cents in the dollar, because I'm spending that extra 10 cents at the moment spinning wheels in administrative inefficiencies. So that's a very simple example. A lot of people, it's difficult to argue with that, even if you want to hang on to your own turf.
Yeah.
So I think one of the most successful implementations of everything we've been speaking about this morning is convincing those 9 companies to say to their own members, we want to fold up and give all our assets to the single national company, and let's get on with it. That requires an enormous amount of stakeholder consultation internally and externally so that everybody can be satisfied that their needs as best as possible can be met going forward. Very challenging and so very rewarding when you see it happen. I've worked in different contexts where you might get 3 states to do that and the rest will hang out. And that may or may not raise the level of efficiency and effectiveness, but still you have an underlying level of inefficiency. But convincing the Heart Foundation to do that was an extremely satisfying thing for me personally, and it certainly has reaped the rewards of that going forward, and still has and still does.
John, I was just wondering, throughout your long career, what aspect or what role would you be most proud of, or even if it's something where you might not have expected it to be such a good outcome, where you've even surprised yourself with the way your role evolved in that situation?
I think this is Danny answering it in 2 ways. One is, what did I personally learn and achieve that was a bit of an insight for me because I wasn't ready for it, and what then was I able to take from those learnings into new areas. That work value case I spoke about back in the early 80s, the complexity is quite enormous, and trying to sort of work through that was part of what I thought was exciting and a good learning experience for me. So, you've got, at that stage, there was probably 300,000 nurses in Australia, and the Australian Nursing and Midwifery Federation commenced a work value case in what was called at the time the Australian Industrial Relations Commission to show via the evidence and convince the Commission that the work of nurses was undervalued. Pretty obvious for a lot of people sitting on the sideline, but you have to show the evidence. Very costly, even back in those days. I think it was over $2 million to run that case back in the early 80s. But it went on for about 9 months, 67 sitting days. There was a full bench of the Australian Industrial Relations Commission, and we went and toured around Australia and visited around about 60 sites, I think from memory, ranging from Aboriginal health services out past Alice Springs to teaching hospitals in Adelaide and Brisbane, community health centres, primary healthcare units. it was a privilege. It was almost like being at university. You were part of a team that went around and had the privilege to examine where nurses worked and could determine and have a better understanding of what value they should be placed in the scheme of workforce. At the same time, the other learning for me about that was if you just gave nurses a $10 pay rise, even back then, the cost to the country was enormous. So every state and territory intervened in that federal case. They all had QCs at the time, now SCs and the like. But there was something like 25 QCs all flopping around the country as part of this case, just because the states understood what would be the economic consequence of positive outcome in the case, even if it was deserved. So I think that for me, I couldn't anticipate any of that. And at that earlier stage of my career, it was a significant, almost like me becoming involved as a nurse in healthcare. It was a significant formulating point for me in terms of how I took a whole lot of different ideas forward.
I guess that's a quality to have when you're pursuing excellence or pursuing a high level. Is you've got a goal in mind, and then being flexible enough um, to deal with outcomes you're not expecting, and maybe even reaching a higher level than what you're anticipating. So there's that balance between having your own aim in mind and then dealing with the things that you don't expect.
I think so, Danny, and that comes back to what I said earlier as well. I think in that about the vulnerability. I think sometimes we get a bit caught up in getting an idea and pushing it, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're receptive to other people who might be saying, "Hey, John, that's a nice idea, but it's never going to work," and or I think you've got to be prepared to be flexible and admit, hey, look, that was a pretty good idea. We gave it a crack, but we didn't get there. So let's not beat each other up. Let's move on. And what's another good idea we can run with?
So, John, I know you've had a lot of different roles throughout your career, and you've given us a lot of really good qualities on excellence. I'm just wondering where you might have picked up these things yourself. Was it through education? Did you have any good mentors along the way? I know you have spoken about how important mentors are. So yeah, I'm quite interested in who you've learnt from.
Yeah, look, I think having mentors is critical, and I think my advice to your listeners is to seek them out. So try and talk to people that you respect and you might think you can learn something from, and ask them for help. Don't feel embarrassed, feel a bit thick-skinned if you want, and ask them, can something as simple as, can you have informal chats, to something more formal where you might meet once a month for a year and just talk about your own life succession planning, etc. I've always had at least 3 or 4 fairly high level, not mentors, but people that I admire who, I feel very selfish in terms of my little world, in terms of what I want to get on and do. And maybe you might want to have Saturday afternoon off and all that stuff, but these people have given to the community in ways that, are just beyond my level of ability to understand what I could do. So, people like, Martin Luther King, they're all common names, but I've read a lot about Martin Luther King, obviously never met the man, but that inspires me to think, how can somebody like that, through, great adversity, continue to see things as glass half full? And what does that mean for me in terms of how I can incorporate some of those, insights and humility into my life. Obviously, Mandela, he's another big one. Somebody more at home that I put in the same bin is Justice Kirby, Michael Kirby. They're consistent in their values. They're consistent in their community involvement. So they're the learnings I get from those higher level mentors, if you want to call them that. And but certainly to your listeners, I would encourage them to look at those they think they can learn from, and start the conversation. Don't wait. And look, understand that it's different to coaching. That's the other thing. Some people still sort of confuse coaching and mentoring. Coaching's more sort of at the grassroots and rudimentary level in terms of what you're actually doing and how you can do things better. But I think mentoring is about your life journey. So it's about work-life balance and getting advice from others who maybe have fallen down a few rabbit holes that they can give you their learnings.
John, what do you think are some of the main issues facing the healthcare sector at the moment, and what are some things you'd like to see happen to move things along?
Yeah, this is a chronically frustrating issue, Denny, in healthcare in Australia, because I think of our federated structure again and our federal constitution. Health is inefficiently divided between responsibilities of the federal government and the state governments, and they're not neatly quarantined into areas that you think would be sensible or efficient or effective. So there's a lot of time, effort, and money wasted spinning wheels. And in fact, I spent a few years of my life as a lawyer working with public servants whose only job was, I'd call it cost shifting. So they were public servants, say, in a particular state, whose job was to say, well, that's not our issue, that's the feds. Then you had feds who do the same thing. They say, no, that's a state issue. But we can't do anything there. Go and talk to the states. So a lot of the ways forward, I think, in terms of sensible policy and implementation of that policy would benefit from having a structure that either maximised return or minimised inefficiency. There was one stage, it was around, I think, the Rudd era, where there was a restructuring of the policy levers in funding terms and responsibility terms between the states and the feds. And that looked as if it was around the Rudd-Gillard period, where it actually looked as if it had some opportunity to create a better way forward for both implementing different types of decisions more quickly and using the money, limited amounts of money we've got, more effectively. That a lot of that was thrown out again when the government changed. So I think when we went from that period of Labor, and I'm not particularly trying to be partisan here, but when we went from that period of Labor federal governments to back a return to the Liberal governments, it was from the Howard, I think, to Abbott type period, a lot of those were pulled apart again. So that's an example of where structurally we've had that since Federation, and it doesn't look like it's going to go away. So we have to live with that, and it's frustrating for all of us, but that plays a big part when we look at sort of aged care, particularly. Aged care is primarily a Commonwealth and a Commonwealth-funded service, but it's also tied up in being on the ground, obviously, in practical terms around the country. And you have to interact with GPs who are, again, funded by the feds to some extent. And you've got primary healthcare centres that might have some state funding. And federal funding, and it stops and starts. So enormous amount of frustration. It gets to the point sometimes where it bubbles over so badly that you have a royal commission, and we've had a string of those more recently in the aged care and the disability space. That's usually a Dutch hole in the dike type situation where it just gets to the point where it needs a reset valve. Governments usually then respond with some extra money and some more concessions, if you like. And it's a matter of that pendulum swing where it continues to come and go. It gets to the point again after a while where it's over-regulated, so nobody can do anything. So then the regulations get thrown out and it becomes more permissive. Then you might get a lot of negligence and inefficiency. So healthcare is very complicated in that sense, particularly when you look at the primary core of you and me that we're looking after, and then you add the human element to that. So no, I don't have any quick answers, Danny. I think by having an evidence base and being very clear on strategic development and some of the issues I said earlier about values and letting teams get on with work, you can at least maximise your ability to return and optimally what you're trying to achieve.
So in that situation, John, do you think for managers who are, I think that was quite interesting how you put it, because it's really true. I've seen that over my interaction, especially with aged care, that kind of pendulum that you're talking about, and kind of not having control of it, having to kind of surf it like a wave. So I'm wondering what your advice would be to managers surfing that wave at the moment, because there's a lot of things to deal with out there. So yeah, I wonder if you've got some advice for managers. Is it just to keep that leadership strong and that team together, as you're saying?
Well, look, I think they're all good fundamental themes to pursue. And as I said, they all sound simple, but it's a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
But coming back to the mentoring commentary, I think another aspect, if you were in a leadership group in any component of retirement living, aged care, community home care sort of thing, look to the market to see whom you think are providing quality and top-notch service. You and your colleagues will know that, and look to see what they're doing well. Some of them will be the leadership qualities, and some will be perhaps they might invest more in various parts of their business that your particular business isn't. But it might give you a whole range of ideas of what you can test out in your own organisation. So I'd do a bit of a mental zoom around the country through all of your professional colleagues, and maybe have a look at the top 10. And you, depending on what your own needs are for your organisation, look to see what you might be able to try out and work with your boards and management teams and your delivery teams to make things better for you.
That's a good point. That we had another guest who said he used the phrase "success leaves clues." So you can, if you look to someone who's achieving what you want to achieve, be it famous people like you've mentioned, or other people in the field, that sounds like a really good strategy.
Yeah, and look, it again, a lot of my comments are pretty trite today, but when you want something done, give it to the busiest person, that sort of thing. I find that most people that I would look up to and respect, even if I didn't even mention any of those words with them, they are so pleased to try and help. The limitation often is you don't ask them. But they're people who are extremely busy, but they'll still be prepared to help you. That might be a phone call, might be a phone discussion. It might be setting you up with other people, so establishing a connection. It might be talking to you about how to work on some of your relationships better. But I find people very generous in how they will help others. I'm certainly a glass half full person, but for those who think the world is on a doomsday journey, I'm not one of them. But we've got a few challenges, and we chip away.
John, something that I'm passionate about but often fail at, especially at my point in life now, is the work-life balance that you mentioned. It's kind of like that elusive thing that seems to be always a work in progress. I've just wondered how you weave that into your busy life and keep yourself happy and positive.
Adam, it's extremely difficult. I think you just have to keep reminding yourself about what's important. And as the three of us know, it is very complicated because, again, if I use my nursing background, it's still predominantly women. And if you have a look at the economic, talk about the pendulum swing, that when the times get tough, you've got more women or people who are nurses who happen to be women going back into the workforce full time. And then when the economy gets better, they may drop back to part time because they still primarily take up a predominant part of the family childbearing role. So that in itself is complicated. So if you talk to those people about work-life balance, they look at you as if you're a mad person because that's I don't have any choice here. We just got to get on with it. So it is complicated, but I think where it becomes real for all of us, it's what's important because and I don't want to get into the violin stuff, but before you know it, it's all over. That's a very small blimp between birth and death, and unless you enjoyed the journey, it's pretty well not worth it. And I know it. I know that's complicated, and I know we all sort of, if our best friend or someone in our family or our neighbour gets some form of terminal illness, usually a cancer or some significant cardiovascular issue, we're extremely empathic. We prioritise helping them, but it's all short term, and then worse still, if they die, we then become tragically sort of upset because we think they were taken too early. But have we learnt anything from that in terms of our own journey? I'm not quite sure, including me. So it's a challenge. I'm a great believer in understanding that the people who make a difference in your life are not the ones with the most credentials, money, and awards. They simply are the ones who care the most about us. And they're the sort of things I think we need to spend more time thinking about and then applying that to our work-life journey.
What do you like to do outside of work, John? I'm just curious to know what kind of things you're interested in.
Well, where I don't live up to my own rhetoric is coming back to Adam's work-life balance is, I suppose, outside of work, because I see life not as a work-life balance. I just see it as life. So it's a bit tricky for me, but I'm not sure I'd try and encourage others to use the same model. But what I do like outside of my formal, if you like, paid work is helping people in a personal growth and resilience sense. So that might be through a formal mentoring type arrangement, or it might be just in terms of those that you interact with, that you are very focused on their personal growth and their resilience and how you can help them. So I get a lot of satisfaction from that. So that's sort of outside my normal sphere. I'm in a dog family and have been forever. So we've currently got 3 dogs, 2 Airedale Terriers and a rescue greyhound. And so we spend quite a bit of time involved in, interacting with them. And, in fact, my wife, she gave a paper about 25 years ago on what I've learned from my dog, and she's now a behavioural dog specialist.
Oh, wow.
And helps other people look after their behaviour issues with their dogs. So that's a big part of our outside work life. And yeah, it's about it.
That sounds like a really interesting paper to read. Like, in an academic sense, like I'm sure you would learn a lot from your dog.
Well, most Australians do have some form of a pet, and we could have a whole conversation in this call about, I mean, every time I get home from a trip, I travel a lot, and the dogs are at the front door waiting to see me again, and
Yeah.
this unrequited love, and it's interesting to reflect on what animals can give to humans.
I just wanted to thank you for your time, John. It's a pleasure to have any connection to you. I consider when we bring you on, it's more than just sharing information. You share wisdom, which is another level to me. And like I said, I'm very lucky to have any connection to you. I've learnt stuff just from observing you, and yeah, a pleasure to bring you to our audience. And I'd love to talk to you again sometime in the future.
Well, I've known you for a long time, Adam, and I've certainly enjoyed our friendship, and Sylvia as well, your mum. And it's a privilege for me to be able to spend some time with you and your audience, and hope we can catch up in person sometime again.
Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you,
too.
John.
Thank you.